Now, normally I just talk off the top of my head, and that's fine because I'm usually only talking about myself. But today this is all about other writers, so forgive me for more or less reading from my notes. And I'd like to welcome you, first of all, to this launch of the LGBTQI International Showcase, where I will be revealing the names of the 10 writers I've chosen to demonstrate the breadth and depth of queer writing in the UK. Now, like me at the start of this, you might be wondering what an international showcase is and how it happened. National Writing Centre in Norwich put their heads together with the British Council and decided it was time to shine a spotlight on some of the best contemporary writing. How do you do that, you might well ask? How do you make it inclusive and yet focused? So they decided to choose 6 categories that cover a wide spectrum of interest. Like all of you here, I suspect, I read a lot, but like most of us, I tend to know what I like. I believe these showcases will provoke us readers to move out of our familiar territory and experience different flavours on our reading palette. Elif Shafak has already launched her selection of women writers at the London Book Fair, and in the autumn Jackie Kay will be revealing her choice of writers of colour. But today we are here to talk about the 10 LGBTQI writers I've chosen to represent the exciting work that embraces a wide range of queer experience. Before I reveal the names of the chosen 10, bit of suspense in here, and let you meet the 3 that are here today on stage with me, I'd like to set the scene for the choices I've made. My first novel was published in 1987. It was the first British crime novel with a lesbian detective. I wrote a lesbian heroine because I'd grown up in a time and place where there were no templates for the life I wanted to live. The queer struggle for self-definition has been pursued in no small part so that the next generation has a springboard for imagining how to live. If you can't see your possible life played out anywhere in your eye line, it's much harder to imagine it. Every literary movement requires pioneers to kick open the door a crack. Others spot the opening and push the door wider. Then at last there's room for everyone to walk through and write the lives they want to write. The only route to publication for me was via an independent feminist publisher. Back then, there were a few radical bookshops that stocked titles like mine, but getting mainstream shops to stock it was an uphill struggle. Managing to get our work reviewed was almost impossible. Finding representations of queer lives took dedication and stubborn persistence if you were a reader. Gradually, that has changed. Now, our words are part of the mainstream of British literary life. The LGBTQI writers are not only published by mainstream publishers and stocked by libraries, bookshops and supermarkets. They win major prizes. For so long conspicuous by our absence, we are now conspicuous by our presence. The 10 writers featured in this showcase reveal the quality and breadth of current LGBTQI writing in Britain today. From novels to memoirs, from short stories to film scripts, from poetry to plays, their work covers a broad spectrum of form, style and content. There is genuinely something here for everyone. Because these writers are writing for everyone. These are not words for a niche readership. These are not writings for a ghetto. These are the works of writers who have something to say that can be and should be heard by as many people as possible. Although their words will have particular resonance for some readers over others, isn't that what good writing always does? LGBTQI writers have forced their way out of the dark corners where we were pushed by a society that didn't want to be reminded of our existence. Thanks to writers such as Ali Smith, Alan Hollinghurst, Russell T. Davis, Carol Ann Duffy, Jeanette Winterston and many more, LGBTQI writers are everywhere, and deservedly praised everywhere too, recommended by reviewers, librarians, teachers, booksellers and friends. Some might say the battle is won, the war is over. But a quick scan of news headlines and social media on any given day gives the lie to that. LGBTQI people are still bullied at school and in the workplace. We are still the targets of hate crime. In many places around the world, our very identity criminalises us. Auden was wrong when he claimed poetry makes nothing happen. Words do change the world, reader by reader. They open our eyes, they provoke thought, they make us uncomfortable in our entrenched positions. The work of these 10 writers will do all of these things. But most of all, they will awaken in us a fresh delight in the wonder of worlds. And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for, the big reveal. I'm going to do this in alphabetical order and say a little bit about each of the writers as I go. First on our list is the Northern Irish writer Colette Bryce. Her poetry is deeply rooted in place, in culture and in politics. The deceptive simplicity of her language disguises a profound engagement with identity. Among her many awards is the Ewart Biggs Award in memory of Seamus Heaney. There's a strong autobiographical element in her work. She writes about Northern Ireland where she says, "Say nothing is still a powerful rule." She clearly believes in saying something, all sorts of somethings in fact. As well as the politics she refuses to stay silent about, she also reaches for emotional truths, writing openly about loving women. But her work also reveals an understanding that honesty comes at a price. In one of her poems, Spider, she writes about trapping a spider under a fine-blown wine glass. "I meant to let him go, but still he taps against the glass, all Marcel Marceau, in the wall that is there but not there, a circumstance I know." Circumstance many of us know. Second on the list is Juno Dawson, who's the prolific and popular author of young adult fiction, as well as journalism and non-fiction. Her memoir, The Gender Games, was her first book for an adult audience. As well as maintaining a prodigious output, she's also a school role model for the LGBTQ charity Stonewall and runs writing and storytelling workshops in underprivileged schools. She grew up in West Yorkshire, now she lives in Brighton. She's worked for Times as writer and a journalist, in her early days interviewing bands including Atomic Kitten and Steps. She contributes regularly to an assortment of periodicals and frequently appears on radio and TV. In 2015, she announced her transition, having previously lived as a gay man. Among her awards, my personal favourite is the Book People's Queen of Teen Award. There's a real brio, honesty and compassion without sentimentality in her work. There's always a light touch there. She avoids jargon. She never talks down to her readers, never strives to be cool and down with the kids. She's not afraid to confront complex issues adolescents often struggle with: mental health, sexuality, self-harm, addiction, and of course, love. She's never coy about queer in all its rainbow colours. She brings a frankness to difficult subjects that shows adolescents that they are not alone, no matter what's bothering them. And importantly, it's never the only aspect that defines a character. She sets out her stall in "This book is gay." Sometimes men fancy men. Sometimes women fancy women. Sometimes women fancy men and women. Sometimes men fancy women and men. Sometimes people don't fancy anyone. Sometimes a man might want to be a woman. Sometimes a woman might want to be a man. Rosie Garland is next on the list. She's an award-winning poet, short story writer, and a novelist whose work also incorporates a wide range of performance. She does poetry, she sings in a post-punk band, and she hosts cabaret as Rosie Lugosi the Vampire Queen. I did a charity dinner with her once. Different. She won the inaugural Mislexia novel competition with her first novel, which led her to a 6-figure book deal with HarperCollins. Her debut, The Palace of Curiosities, is set in 1950s London, and it was described by Sarah Waters as a jewel box of a novel. I think any of us would be happy with that, frankly. Her latest novel is The Night Brother, a bold and dazzling tale of hermaphrodite doubleness in fin de siècle Manchester. This is magic realism in style and substance, but Rosie uses the strangeness of her fantastical world to examine and explore notions of belonging and identity, gender and sexuality, and how we come to define ourselves and our place in the world. You can hide all sorts of serious engagement beneath the sparkle and the dark. There's an energy and an engine to her writing that swirls through the pages and sweeps the reader along. As readers, we need to know where this book is going and how it's going to get there. Juliet Jacques is a filmmaker and a journalist. She writes on literature, film, art, music, politics, gender, sexuality, and football for a variety of publications in the UK and abroad. Trans, a memoir, combines her personal story of transition with critiques of trans theory, literature, and film. And there's a real clarity and candour here. This is a journey from a narrative that doesn't fit the narrator to a continuing story that's tailored to suit. Too often the idea of transitioning is seen as black and white, but Juliet explores the grey areas between the absolutes, revealing the possibilities of where we all might fit on the continuum of gender and sexuality. It's also a vivid portrait of searching for queer in the 90s and the 2000s, and I have to say, having lived in Manchester at the same time as you did, I think I can totally get those sections. I remember what it was like looking for queer in Manchester. But it's more than one person's journey. It's also an exploration of attitudes and social change. And there's a significant section on the politics of life writing that deals with questions like who gets to speak and what they're allowed to say. How do you avoid cliches when they sometimes apply to your own life? And who are you writing for? Juliet acknowledges the pain and the struggle, but never in a poor me kind of way. This is by no means a roadmap, but I can see how it could be talismanic for someone who feels gender dysphoric. Keith Jarrett is a poet, fiction writer and playwright, currently completing a novel exploring the migration of religion from the Caribbean to London. Safest Spot in Town was performed at the Old Vic and on BBC4 as part of the Queers series. He's a poetry slam champion, both in the UK and internationally. He's writing about finding himself in the contradictions and oppositions of his world, the biblical tradition he grew up in that gave him the great rolling music of words and stories, and the South London youth culture with its DJs and its different jazz of hip-hop and heavy bass, the Caribbean of his roots and the outer inner cities of zones 4, 5 and 6, what it is to be a gay man and what it feels like to be him. A foot in both camps can make us feel like we belong in neither, but he's making a new synthesis here. Even his acknowledgements in Saleh, his debut poetry collection, are a poem. Here's a few lines from that. We of pursed lips and handbag humour and zone 4, 5, 6 commutes, we who once knew these streets by their bus shelters, who still know these streets by their old names, Racism Road, Homophobia Grove, Bigot Hill, we who know history's desire to repeat, we who do not take for granted. I love the muscle of his verse. Kirsty Logan is a Scottish poet, short story writer, novelist and writing mentor. Her writing reworks folk tales, fairy stories, myth and magic to explore desire, identity and our hidden queer lives. Her first short story collection, The Rental Heart and Other Fairy Tales, won the Polari First Book Prize, the Scott Prize for Short Stories and the Saboteur Award for Best Short Story Collection. The sea always wants things to change, the land wants to stay the same. And that's what the narrator of her last novel, The Gloaming, says. And it's that tension that she explores in her short stories and her novels. The fear of loss that comes with change, the eagerness to embrace what might be a possibility. She has a fantastical imagination that embraces mermaids and human statues, that's rooted in the impossibility of pinning things down to the prosaic. Her latest collection, Things We Say in the Dark, is fabulous in the literal sense. Feminist fairy tales laced with horrors that leap out of the dark and leave a sooty handprint on your soul. The stories are interspersed with what at first sight might be autobiographical notes from the author's domestic life with her wife. But that's as much of a fable as everything else. Or is it? Andrew Macmillan, who should have been with us this afternoon but couldn't be here because he's stuck on a train somewhere near Carlisle. Andrew's multi-award-winning first collection, Physical, was the first poetry collection ever to win the Guardian First Book Award. He explores marginal lives and modern masculinity, as well as his own lived experience as a gay man from the north of England. He was a candidate in the 2019 election for the Oxford Professor of Poetry. When I think back to my own earlier reading, the coded messages of poets like Tom Gunn and W.H. Auden were forced by the convention of their time into lines we all learned to read between. Andrew Macmillan's poetry is all the more astonishing. In his latest collection, Playtime, he writes with such tender insight into the process of growing into himself. There's no shame, no sense of looking over his shoulder to see if he's going to get into trouble for writing so openly. The beauty of his tender and fierce poetry about men loving each other is that it's written in the same terms that a heterosexual poet would have at their disposal. It's one of his, excuse me, I have to get into the Iron Brew. And one of the poems from Playtime is called Anaphora Penises. I just want to read the opening of that. I disagree with you on this one small point. The time you said of penises, when you've seen one, you've seen them all, I think. You're wrong. Each one is fingerprint unique, each with its own way of being in the world, shy or all bravado or statesmanlike. Now, I can feel the smile twitching at the corners of my mouth just reading that. Next up is Fiona Mosley. Her first novel, Elmet, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2017 and won the Polari Prize. It's lyrical, ethereal, but sometimes brutal. It's an intense exploration of what it means to be different to the other members of your social group. We discover the truths of one family's disconnected life within a meditation on the Yorkshire landscape where it unfolds. And there's space, even in the small, close family unit, for other kinds of difference. It's a world of isolation and simmering violence, but it's also a world that can encompass Daniel, who is more like his absent mother than his rage-filled father. Daniel likes to make things nice, but for his ultra-macho father, that isn't an issue. Elmet reminds us that queer encompasses a world of difference as well as similarities. It's Badlands and beauty, a cross between Wuthering Heights and Hansel and Gretel, the original Brothers Grimm version. It's a kind of lyrical gothic that hints of some different kind of life for Daniel. After all, he says towards the end, you have to appreciate that I never thought of myself as a man. Mary Paulson-Ellis' fiction is firmly rooted both in the secret lives of Edinburgh and what she calls the murderous side of family life, the dark, the quirky and the strange. Her debut novel, The Other Mrs. Walker, was Waterstone's Scottish Book of the Year. Her second novel, The Inheritance of Solomon Farthing, deals with a web of relationships that spans the century from the First World War. In her second novel, she explores the interweaving of men's lives across 3 generations, their complex connections as lovers and friends from boyhood to decrepitude underpin this multi-layered story. It's anchored by Solomon Farthing, an heir hunter. That's heir as in person who inherits the estate, not the person who's looking to breathe. People care about that, even when the estates in question seem pitifully small. But the loves and loyalties that permeate this satisfyingly fat book are anything but small. From the Great War to contemporary Edinburgh, Mary Paulson-Ellis paints an irresistible panorama of lives that are square pegs in round holes. And it will break your heart with its twists and turns. Here's how it opens. Do you mind if I read a wee bit of it? Yes. In the end there was one, but there should have been 2 dead men laid out among the walnut shells, skin already blue. A great rose bloomed over the dead man's heart, there on his second best shirt, bright amongst the decay. Those who were left looked away, thinking of the one who should have been there but was not, lungs like wings of ice holding him to the bottom of a river where none of them would have to follow now. It's lyrical, it's elliptical, and doesn't it make you desperate to read on? Finally, Luke Turner is a writer, an editor, filmmaker, and founder of the music website The Creatus, where he also presents a podcast. His queer memoir, Out of the Woods, marries nature writing with his struggle to reject the binary and accept his internal contradictions. Epping Forest is somewhere he's known since childhood, and it becomes a sort of haven after the end of his 5-year relationship with his girlfriend. The forest and its environs become a kind of extended metaphor for his sense of loss and his need to explore the side of himself that has failed to find full expression in the past. His sexual encounters in the forest are encounters with himself as much as with the strange men he fucks there. They give him the possibility of giving in to his own love of risk. And yet, set against this, he never quite rejects his Methodist upbringing, still enjoying churches and hymns and the grace he sees in his parents. It's not just sexuality that drives this memoir, it's the relationship between history and the present, between the grotty side of urban life and the weirdly uneasy atmosphere of the forest. It's anything but an idyll. So that's our list of 10. And I hope you'll agree with me that this is like an exquisite box of chocolates that you can gorge on without guilt. Now, 3 of these talented writers are here to join us this afternoon. Please welcome Juliet, Jacques, Kirsty, Logan, and Mary Paulson-Ellis. Now, you've heard me going on for quite long enough, so I'd like you all, please, to read us a little something that gives us a flavour of your work. Shall we stick with the tried and tested alphabet? Would you like to start, Juliet?
All right, I'm actually going to read something from a work in progress. This is part of my next project, which is a volume of short stories that tell a history of transgender people in Britain, but through fiction going back from the Victorian period to the present. They're written in a variety of different forms. One of them is a set of diary entries, one of them is a film script, one of them is a set of blog posts, one of them is a chapter from an invented memoir, and they've all got different characters representing the sort of different varieties of trans and non-binary identities and how they've been constituted in Britain over the last 150 years or so. I'm going to read to you from the second story in the collection, which is called A Woman of No Importance. And as the title maybe suggests, it's set around the Oscar Wilde trial. The story follows a poet and writer in their early 20s called Arthur or Anthea Parr, who has moved to London from Manchester to try and launch a literary career, but also to try and eke out a kind of proto-trans identity in these queer literary spaces where Oscar Wilde and others operated, but of course does this at the exact time that Wilde is on trial, and there's a real clampdown on gross indecency, as the language of the time had it. So I'm going to read you a short extract where Arthur Anthea organises a drag ball in East London. One of the group had a family friend who ran a hotel in Aldgate. They would not disclose their real purpose, they agreed with Parr, but they would tell the proprietor that they were holding a party after a wedding. As it transpired, this contains a glint of truth. Otherwise, Parr applied all his learning from the Temperance Hall ball in Manchester in 1880, which was busted by the police with 50 people arrested. Entry would be allowed only by password, using the same one that the revellers in Hume had used, Sister. And the pianist, recommended by John Severs, would be a man of poor sight. That's true, that actually happened. The pianist at the drag ball in Hume in Manchester was blind, so wouldn't be able to tell the police that everyone had been there in drag. So unlike his predecessors in Manchester, Parr ensured that every window was covered, no matter how hard it might be to peer into, and they had an obvious escape plan to be explained to everyone who gave the password. They had a code word for a raid. If it were yelled, they would leave via the fire exit, race down the spiral staircase and head east, and that code word was Cromwell. Parr had wanted to make illustrated invites, but Aubrey Beardsley was too busy and worried about making himself ill, but would at least attend and might incorporate certain scenes into future books. Having listened to all of this, I had to admit my curiosity. The Yellow Book organised a dinner in Bloomsbury, the editors doubtless wanting to give themselves an alibi if Parr and his cohort ended up on trial. I chose to go to the ball, despite hearing via a friend that Alfred Taylor, Oscar Wilde's co-defendant, had been cross-examined in court that morning about having had a woman's dress, wig and stockings in his rooms, his presence at a drag party at Fitzroy Street and his lack of occupation, but mostly his interest in young men. I had no desire to wear female attire, then or at any other time, but I wanted to see how close Parr's reality came to his fantasy. The Cumberland Hotel could never live up to the distant, starlit plains of Parr's stories and dreams, and in truth, nor could most of the attendees. There were about 25 of them, an impressive number, given the understandable reticence of the invitees, although their costumes proved a huge letdown. I know mine did, the cheapest suit in my possession, chosen more because it was the most amenable to a hasty exit than for any stylistic reason. There were just a handful of people in female attire, with the ladies outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, and potential suitors further disappointed, as 2 of the ladies danced only with each other. Most were not convincing, either because they were too tall or too broad, or dressed in a fashion 50 years past, in corsets that did little to hide their girth, or in one case, sporting lipstick and rouge around a thick brown beard and moustache, which, she said, my wife will not let me shave. Parr, however, had spared no expense in making himself a work of art, and was never in danger of being upstaged. He'd purchased a new dress with even higher sleeves and an even lower neck than the last one I'd seen, adorned with roses, worn with silk gloves and stockings. Where Parr found it, let alone how Parr paid for it, remains a mystery. Anthea was the last attendee to enter, to applause, whistles, and Wagner's bridal chorus. One gentleman, unfamiliar to me, threw a bouquet at her feet and took her hand. After much revelry, the music stopped. The guests began to cheer and clap, and a man in a suit walked onto the floor to tell everyone that we had gathered tonight to celebrate the holy matrimony between Anthea Parr and Cromwell. One attendee must have been an informer and may have spent the night noting the names and faces of his fellow guests. It may even have been someone associated with the Yellow Book, although I hope not. Later, I learned that the Manchester revellers had borrowed the code word sister from previous balls, which had allowed the police to guess the password and gain access to the Temperance Hall, and had made it even more reckless for Parr to use it, but maybe no one had told her so. In any case, I had sensibly, if not courageously, spent much of my evening by the fire escape. I hurried down the stairs, not looking back as I ran all the way to the London hospital. I saw Aubrey Beardsley struggling after me. I sometimes wonder how many years those few seconds took off his life, but he did escape that night, down Leman Street and then to who knows where. But as the picture of Dorian Gray had led us to expect, the police did not follow us into the depths of Whitechapel. Parr, in her tight corset and long silk train, was not so nimble nor so lucky.
Thank you. Thank you. Kirsty, what have you got for us?
Something creepy. So I'm going to read from my new book. It's actually not out until October. For Halloween, you know, it's horror. It's called Things We Say in the Dark, and I'm going to read you a very small story from this book. And I chose this one because it explains why there is a pomegranate on the cover. If you like pomegranates, I apologise for what I'm about to do. I should also say the book is in 3 parts. Part 1 is all fears and horrors to do with houses and shelters, boundaries, things like that. And the last part is sort of childhood fears, like very sort of primal type fears. And the middle part, which I'm going to read from, is fears of pregnancy, childbirth, parenthood, things like that. So again, if you are currently pregnant or are planning to be pregnant in the near future, I apologise for what I'm about to do. So this story is called My Body Cannot Forget Your Body. You've heard that when you give birth, the baby can come out in a variety of forms, but there's really no need to worry about it. Whatever emerges, eventually it will all come together and make a baby. You might give birth to a quartet of mango-sized objects, or maybe a whole big bunch of grape-sized objects, painless but takes a while. Or, if you're unlucky, a pair of blood orange-sized objects, which you haven't seen but imagine is a bit of a struggle. You've heard of women delivering things like runner beans, like carrots, like kumquats. However the baby comes out, it will all be fine in the end. Your friend Edith births 5 equal-sized lemons. She says it was awful, just awful. But in the post-birth photo she puts online, she's wearing lipstick and her forehead isn't even shiny. So you're unconvinced. You think you'd quite like to give birth to lemons if you can't have runner beans. You don't get a choice what grows inside you, of course, but you can still hope. Your other friend, Lucille, births a poppering mess of pomegranate seeds. Her husband left her, so you're there at the birth, and you see the flood of wet, red seeds, and it seems it will go on forever. It doesn't look sore, but you still don't want to give birth to pomegranate seeds. During the birth, Lucille squeezes your hand so tight the bones scrape. And a month later, when you visit her and the baby, she's still talking about the pain. To be honest, you think it's a bit overdramatic. The seeds must have hurt less coming out than they did going in. But now it's your turn. And it's not good news. Don't forget, this is a horror book, sorry. Look down. You see the size of your bump, how big it's grown, that thing that's even bigger than the biggest melon you've ever seen. That's what you'll give birth to, all in one go. Ripping, splitting, round and hard and ripe. It's unusual, yes, but then aren't you unusual? You always were, your mother would say, if she wasn't dead, if she hadn't died delivering the huge, violent, melon-shaped mass of you all those years ago. Come on now. You can't put it off any longer. It's time to push. You may be unusual, but you are not special. The doctor has others after you. On the surgical tray, the needle and thread lie ready.
Mary, yes.
I'm not sure I can follow that.
Sorry.
I have to. Thanks, Kirsty. Okay, so well, Val's already said a little bit about this book, which is my new book, which is coming out officially 5th of September. But for those of you in Edinburgh, it will be available at the book festival from about a week's time, because I'm doing an event there. What I'm going to do, it deals with men's lives who are connected over 3 generations. So it has a narrative set in Edinburgh in the present day, where we have our heir hunter who's in his 60s and a bit of a shambolic character, down on his luck and owes money left, right and centre, which is why he's pursuing this estate of someone who's died with no next of kin. And what I'll do is read you a little bit about from him, and then I'll also read you a little bit from the past. And the past in this novel goes back to a group of men who are in France at the very, very end of 1918, at the end of the war in 1918, and they know the war is going to end, but they don't know exactly when, and it's a question of what goes on between them as they wait for the end to happen. Okay. So this is Solomon Farthing, and he's been down at London at Kew at the National Archives, searching for the family tree of the person who's died, whose money he wants to get his hands on. And he's come out of Kew, and he's heading to a reckoning with his own past. It took Solomon Farthing an hour before he arrived at his next destination. Somewhere south of the river, deep in the heart of Battersea, surrounded by a tall iron fence. A graveyard of a different sort of green to Kew, haphazard and choked with weeds. Not far from the bridge from which his father had taken that fateful fall. The cemetery's burial ground had been exhausted in the 1960s, given over now to butterflies and trees, insects and other creatures flitting amongst the stones. Solomon entered by the gate on the main road and was quickly subsumed. He wandered south through the graves, no map, no guide, just a myriad of paths and a reference scribbled in biro on the back of his hand. The cemetery reminded Solomon of his favourite burial ground back home. Hundreds of gravestones laid flat amongst the shorn grass at one end, hundreds more buried by nettles at the other. It too was a haven for wildlife, the wren, the magpie, the dog fox and his bitch. Not to mention 1,000 tiny mammals tunnelling their way through leaf mould and the crumbled bones of the dead. Edinburgh's secret garden, that was what they called it. The nearest thing Solomon had to what could be called a family plot. The perfect cruising ground for the low flight of the tawny owl and the glorious boys of his youth. The place where he had first met Andrew, standing in the twilight by a soft grey tomb, all its carving eroded by the rain. Solomon remembered escaping from the silence of his grandfather to lie amongst a forest of obelisks and stone crosses, ivy snatching at his feet. 16 and dreaming of another life, the soft black of an Edinburgh night cut through by the rustle of 1,000 rodents in amongst the undergrowth, human and animal both. The grass had been tall. It had been wet. Cuckoo spit smeared across his shirt. His head had been thumping with an overdose of adrenaline, or perhaps the stolen sherry he had drunk. Above him the planet had spun on its axis. Beneath him he'd felt the damp embrace of the earth. He remembered doing his count. 1 leg, 2 legs, 2 arms, 5 fingers, just as his grandfather had taught. lifting Solomon to sit on the draining board in the scullery that very first night, checking one limb after another as though to make sure the boy was safe. Solomon had lain in the cemetery for an hour perhaps, waiting with his heart in his throat to see what might happen next. Then Andrew had appeared, and his life had taken a whole new turn. Thank you. And just to finish off, so this is his grandfather, who's called Godfrey Farthing, and this is him as a young man in 1918. What does it mean to love a man? That was what Captain Godfrey Farthing found himself asking as he crawled and slithered across the few frozen yards towards the river, nothing but saplings and stubby weed beds, a grassy field on the opposite bank waiting to become a killing ground. The perfect place in which to shoot a man dead. Beneath his shirt, he could feel the shrapnel shifting, a ghost beneath his skin. He had spent 4 terrible years pondering that question, and the closest he had got to an answer was watching 2 boys kiss in the shadow of a barn. Godfrey had never tasted love himself, at least not in the way he had imagined it might be, with a girl who swung her skirts and dared to show her ankles, someone he could have taken home for his mother to meet for tea. But now, as the first light started silvering the willows, Godfrey wondered if in fact he had understood love only too well, here in this Eden, crawling through a drainage ditch to save who might be left. And before, amongst the mud and oily soup of a trench, men of every shape and distinction lying about his feet. Godfrey had understood it then, and he understood it now, that feeling deep inside that once released might keep him from having the courage to stick the bayonet in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Lots there to whet the appetite. So, I'm going to ask you 1 or 2 things now. And then later on there'll be an opportunity for members of the audience to ask us any questions they might have. So you might want to have that running and through the back of your mind, because if nobody volunteers, I'll just pick on you at random. So those of us on the platform here, we're all queer in one form or another. It's clearly an important part of our identities, but it's not the only thing that defines who we are, both as human beings and as writers. How do you see your queerness in terms of your writing and your life? Who wants to start?
Oh God, I'm going to have to start now. Yes. Well, I suppose for me, I sort of came of age as a queer person, or as I would say a gay person, which is absolutely going to age me, I think, date me. In the 1990s. I was in my 20s. I was quite late in some ways to come out to myself before anybody else as well. This was off the back of the AIDS crisis in the 80s and Section 28, of course. You know, it was still a time when if you wanted to watch something that was gay themed on television, you had to wait till sort of 11:30 or midnight for Channel 4. Thank God for Channel 4, you know. And so I think it took me a long time to sort of, you know, go, who am I? And who do I want to be? Who is the real person? Who's the real Mary inside? And so it was exactly that same time that I was thinking maybe I'd like to be a writer, although that seemed like a very far away fantasy, you know. And so in some ways for me, the two that sense of self-discovery as in terms of sexuality and then as a writer have gone along in parallel. You know, I think it's interesting that I tend to write about outsiders. You know, I don't necessarily, I mean, I have got gay characters in my books, and definitely when I was starting out writing, which was a long journey towards writing, 15 years, I was thinking, I want all the panoply of people to be in my book. So the idea of having a gay character in my books or gay relationships in my books was just totally normal to me. In the same way that with my first novel, I wanted the protagonist to be a middle-aged woman, because you didn't see a lot of middle-aged women leading the charge, you know. And so I suppose, therefore, I just have lived that 20, 30 year generation moment where we've gone from being the outsider to being the mainstream. And so in some ways my characters are inherently outsiders, but the fact of their gayness or the fact of their sexuality is just part of the mainstream of their lives as well. And so in some ways that's how these two things have come together for me.
Yeah, I didn't know I was a mainstream writer until I was told that I was. When I was writing my first novel, so all my books have queer characters in them. They also have non-queer characters in them, because there's room for everyone in this world. And when I was writing my first novel, I thought it's going to be quite a niche novel. So it's a kind of magical realist book, and it's about two women, a journey of two women to kind of come together and be in a relationship together. They go on kind of epic quests and then for separate things and then end up together. And I thought, oh, that's pretty niche, both the genre and the queer element. And then was completely taken by surprise when it turned out it was actually quite mainstream. I had a mainstream publisher, and they published it quite widely, put it on billboards, and it was like on Radio 2. And all of this took me utterly by surprise, because I thought that I was a queer writer writing a queer book, therefore I was niche, therefore it was not of interest to the general reader, who I for some reason perceived as heterosexual, which is a bit silly really. So yeah, I was pleasantly surprised to find that my books had much more mainstream appeal than I had been led to believe would be the case. So I was really pleased about that, although it shouldn't really have come as a surprise to me, because of course when I was a teenager, I was reading people like Sarah Waters, who, she has massive mainstream appeal because the books are amazing. I just read those, and even now I'm trying to see how all the cogs fit together and I can't figure it out. Absolutely amazing. So yeah, I was really surprised, and I think if there's anything that I'm trying to do through all of my books, because this is going to be the 5th one, so in my head I'm working on the 6th one now, so I feel like I can kind of take a little bit of a step back and see them as a whole now. And I think what I'm trying to do is to show moving beyond a binary. So I am not a trans person, so I don't identify that way, but it's an identity that I think is really interesting to explore. And I've never really felt one thing or the other. So for example, I was born in England, but to Scottish parents, so I didn't really fit in there. And then when I was 12, I moved up to Glasgow with my English accent. Didn't really fit in there either. And when people say, where are you from? And I say Glasgow, they go, oh, like, yes, actually, I may not sound that Glaswegian, but that is where I'm from. So I never really didn't really see myself as English or Scottish. And then being bisexual as well, people always want you to choose. Do you like guys or do you like women? And now I am married to a woman, so people say, oh, so you're a lesbian now, and I'm just like, okay, fine, like I don't care, you can put any label that you like on me. But I'm intrigued that everyone seems so obsessed with these binaries, like you have to be this thing or you have to be this thing, and I just don't. I think that so few things in this world, if anything, can fit into you have to be this thing or you have to be this thing. So if I can do anything with my books, it's trying to muddy that a little bit and try and say, actually, the best place to be is somewhere along these beautiful spectrums that we have in this world.
There are one or two binaries though, like Brexit. I think that's a binary at this point in time.
Can we not bring the B word in? Can we not?
Yes,
but in general,
can we have a safe space of no B word?
But totally,
Yeah,
I think absolutely what you're saying.
That's our
totally
code where we all have to leave.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
Taken back at this point. No, sorry to any Irish people here, obviously wouldn't do that. So, yes, I grew up wanting to be a writer. I knew from the age of about 14, 15 that I just wanted to write. And I knew at the same time I didn't have a language for it at all. I had some gender issue. All I really knew was that I wasn't supposed to talk about it. Obviously, there was a law in place, Section 28, that prevented any real effective conversation about gender or sexuality in any meaningful public forum that was open to me as someone at secondary school. And the writers who were available to me at that point, like none of them were openly trans or non-binary. I didn't have this vocabulary at all, so I became very interested in issues around limits of language and expanding language for people and giving language to things. And you know, one of the main people who was sort of giving me a language was picking through this kind of queer history and decodifying it in some ways and codifying it in other ways was Morrissey, about whom the less said the better. And I haven't read his book, actually. He's a novelist too. Well, he is. And so, you know, I didn't really have, you know, writers who really showed me myself in terms of content. I was very interested in questions of form. And when I sort of graduated from university in the early noughties, I really thought that to be a great writer, like the writers I read, were largely like dead, straight white men, like sort of Bertolt Brecht or Vladimir Mayakovsky, the Soviet poet who was probably the most heterosexual writer ever, apart from maybe Norman Mailer. You know, people who were grappling with like the big ideological questions of their time, and I thought that was what literature was. And it was only really as I moved into my mid-20s that I discovered trans and non-binary writers and kind of found a framework for understanding myself through them, because before I just had like Jerry Springer. It was awful. And basically, you know, I really, because I had read quite a lot of modernist and postmodernist authors, a lot of people who were quite obscure, quite niche, like you guys were saying. You know, I originally wanted to write this volume of short stories I've just talked about and publish it with a small publisher. I was reading a lot of Latin American authors who would sort of combine modernist or postmodernist forms with this kind of radically queer critique of society. I'm thinking of people like the Argentine playwright Coppi, who was a sort of gay man. He wrote a play about Eva Peron, where Peron had to be played by a drag queen. This went down very badly. People like that really kind of interested me, but I sort of realised that because the mainstream media was actually doing a lot of damage to trans people in the mid-2000s. You know, alternative comedy would use sort of trans characters as kind of visual punching bags. Conservative pundits would attack trans people on the grounds that, you know, we transgress gender roles and were too weird. A certain type of like feminist critic, usually in The Guardian, would attack trans people for not being radical enough a lot of the time and apparently conforming to gender stereotypes and gender roles. And you know, I was sort of writing against all of these things simultaneously and actually realised I did want to work in a more mainstream context because I'd been growing up without really having anyone speak to me. And of course the context was different by the late 2000s. By the late 2000s there was actually an awful lot of material on trans and non-binary identities, but you really had to kind of look for it. It was quite disparate. And I ended up pitching a transition blog to The Guardian in the hopes that it would kind of collect a lot of that material together, create a kind of central talking point about the gender reassignment process through the NHS, about how trans issues are represented in culture, would have open comments, so it'd be something that people could talk about, and ended up working for a while in a much more mainstream context. And that worked for a while until there was a, you know, much more coordinated and much more kind of thought through and I think I would say much more vicious pushback against the emergence of trans identities in a lot of apparently liberal spaces and publications. And so I found myself sort of moving away from mainstream journalism again, platforms like The Guardian, The New Statesman that opened up to me and other trans writers in the early 2010s have now been closed off to us again by the editorial positions they've taken up. So I actually found myself going back to this volume of short stories and feeling at this point that was a much more interesting project because actually, you know, there's quite a lot of trans memoir and theory by this point, but very, very little trans literature, especially in this country. So at this point, I'm much more interested now in working in fictional forms, be that drama, short fiction, potentially novels. So yeah, it's been this interesting journey of moving between mainstream and alternative spaces, depending on what's politically expedient for this trans representation.
Can I just pick up on something you said, Juliet? Because I think that's really interesting about this idea of sort of queering forms a little bit, which I think I'm hoping that moving forward publishing and book selling as well will be more open to forms that don't fit into one or the other. And, you know, my books now are 50-50 short story collections and novels, but that's how they're marketed, but I don't really approach them that way. So, you know, like you were saying, this book's got a sort of frame story, so everything sort of hangs together, so it's kind of novelistic in that way, and then the novels are in little sections, so they could be a bunch of short stories put together, and like your short stories are based on facts, so they're not quite historical, but they're not quite fiction either. And I don't know if the way that publishing and book selling is set up at the moment really suits that, but I hope that it will, because I think that queering of form is great, and I wish that there was more of it.
Yeah, I think so. And it always takes a long time to shift the publishing monolith, but you know, the more we push at the door, the more we kick it open, the better it becomes for all readers who have the chance to experience things that are not just sort of channeled into this is the novel form, this is the short story form, this is the memoir, this is the counterfactual, this is the science fiction. The more we blur these lines, I think the more interesting it becomes as an experience for readers. I just want to, before we open up to the audience, because I'm conscious that we're tight for time, which writers were your touchstones? Who first showed you like a possible world that you could imagine being part of in your writing, in your life?
Well, we were just talking about queering forms, and when I was 22, 23, I was at the University of Sussex and started reading people like Kate Bornstein, Leslie Feinberg, Sandy Stone, Patrick Califia, Vivienne Lamas, this first wave of North American transgender theorists in the 90s. And Kate Bornstein wrote very interestingly in a book called Gender Outlaw about searching for a transgendered writing style, so really setting up that quest to find forms that were appropriate for a community that, you know, didn't fit into male or female, which of course is such a big structural starting point for pretty much all literature, is whether the protagonists are male or female and what kind of subjectivity comes with that. So yeah, they were very important to me.
Well, for me, there were two books in particular that I read at a very impressionable age of sort of early 20s. And one is a book by Emma Donoghue called Kissing the Witch, which is a book of retold fairy tales, but sort of lesbian queer retellings. That was very influential, not surprisingly, on me. And also a book by Michelle T called Valencia, which is about her growing up queer, and the way that she writes about queer bodies and queer sex was just incredible to me. And I knew that you'd ask this, so I came prepared. And these are two writers, so these are both new books, which have been massively influential on me, and I love them. I think they're fantastic. And one is this poet, Sophia Blackwell, who was a lesbian poet. Actually, this is her and her wife on the cover, which I think is really sweet. And her poetry is just amazing. It's so beautiful and sensual, and a lot of the poems are ungendered, so people of any gender could read them romantically to their lovers if they want to. My wife's sitting there going, why have you never read me these poems? I will. And the other one is this writer, Daniel Ortberg, and this book, The Merry Spinster, is just amazing. Some books just pop the top of your head off in the best possible way. I was enraged while reading this that I hadn't written it, because it's just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So those two as well. You know, I continue to be inspired by other writers, of course, with everything that I read as well.
Well, in the 1980s, when I was a teenager, we were obsessed with the Virago classics that, in their beautiful dark green jackets. You know, me and my friends are very into feminism, into politics. That's what we were all talking about. And on the literature side, it was the reissued Virago classics that we used to spread amongst between ourselves. Things like Angela Carter, and you know, that's the kind of thing. In terms of specifically gay book, if you want to call it that, but it kind of was. It's an iconic book, really, was Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story. I mean, I remember reading that when I was maybe 15 or 16 or something, and going, oh, what's this now? This is interesting. And I think it was interesting for me as well that it had to be a man's story, a boy's story. You know, I couldn't find the girl's story. I obviously wasn't looking in the right place. I think I was just fumbling in the dark at that point. But I came upon Edmund White's book and have carried it with me ever since. I think once I got into the 90s and I was kind of going, oh, hello, you know. I was reading Stella Duffy's detective series with the Saz Martin character, which I totally loved, and that was a lesbian sort of private investigator character, which I really loved. And I was reading the Lindsay Gordon series, Val series, which were just absolutely fantastic and completely different. Nothing like them had been done. And they also felt like a bit special to find, because they were women's press, weren't they, with the stripy spines. Visual spine is obviously important to me. and so you had to sort of, go out of your way to track them all down. I do remember sort of being quite pleased when I got the whole series. So those were some of my touchstones, particularly in terms of the sort of detective fiction, the sort of crime fiction, which my books sort of touch on, that's the idea of a detective story, which I love. I think the other person for me who was very important in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s was Ali Smith. I remember viscerally reading Free Love and Other Stories, which is her first short story collection, and understanding then what is possible with language. Now, of course, she talks all about sexuality, gender, all of these things, but for her, what it's all about is language, what you can do with words. And so that idea of what the words free love mean, I won't say go out and buy the collection and read that story. I just have always carried that again as a writer in my head, but also as someone who felt utterly free to play with ideas of gender and sexuality too.
More food for thought there. We're close to running out of time, but we've got time for a couple of questions from the audience. 2 questions, I'm being told, yes. So, would anyone like to start the ball rolling? Please, someone start the ball rolling. Yes.
Hi, this is a question for Juliet, actually. You talked earlier about trans memoir and you talked earlier about trans memoir and trans theory being quite full and fiction being relatively unexplored. In what ways are you interested to explore fiction going forward in your writing?
Well, I mean, obviously I chose to write a volume of historical fiction because it strikes me that, in terms of collecting transgender history, I did a history degree and was always told, this sort of postmodern approach to history, you can't transpose identities onto people who preceded them, which obviously there's a pincer movement between that and just good old-fashioned prejudice, which just says, no, you're a new thing, you've never existed in the past, why are you being weird? And, obviously fiction, can sort of explore subjectivity in different ways. You can find, historical kind of cross-dressers, people who behave in a way that, to me, I feel some affinity with as a trans person, and explore the sort of subjectivity of it, and explore the circumstances in which they're moving, I think in a way that, theory can't really do in the same way. That tends to be more rooted in the present. History can't do in quite the same way because you're not allowed to get under the skin of the characters in quite the same way. So I think fiction, has real potential for obviously kind of eking out those histories, but also creating empathy in a different way. You can explore, with fiction, with memoir, I got quite frustrated by being just constrained by the facts of my own life. I'm sort of trying to sell you my memoir. But a lot of it was quite boring. I had arguments with my editor. The memoir starts with me at university in the early noughties, and I wrote those chapters, and my editor was like, there's too much of this book of you just saying I didn't care about this, I didn't want to do that. And I was like, well, I was like a depressed, stoned teenager from the 90s. That's who I was. If you commission a memoir, then that's what's going to be in it. And obviously with fiction, you can create characters who can illuminate the challenges for trans people in a really different way. They don't necessarily have to happen to you, just to people who like you. So yeah, I think it's more elastic in its possibilities.
Would it be fair to say that the trans fiction will have come of age when there's a trans protagonist in a novel where the most important thing about them is not their gender identity?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think we need queer James Bond first.
Well, they asked,
action
they
hero.
asked, they asked me
who's
to do
queer.
James Bond, and I said no.
I want.
I just,
Why?
I couldn't see any way of making it work for me, really. You know, sort of.
But that would be great, wouldn't it? But it's interesting what you were saying before, Kirsty, about how the idea that the publishing industry is getting more interested in blurring the lines between the forms. You know, the idea now that you can publish what would, a few years ago would have been called a novella, because it's, you know, this thick, and now it's a novel, and no one even really questions that. Or the idea that short stories and novels, novellas, they all cross over. But I actually worry because of this idea of the extremes that's going on at the moment, that publishing houses are also going to retrench slightly. You know, because of sensitivity readers is this new thing where if you write, you know, if you are not of a certain community and you write a character who is of that community, they get worried that you're going to say the wrong thing, that you're going to do the wrong thing. And I think that is a very interesting territory. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have someone give you a different perspective, but I am just saying people can hide behind that as well. Of course, a writer in their room is just trying to explore their imagination, and that's what matters. And they should be free to explore their imagination
Nothing
in every
should be
way.
outside
Yes.
the possibilities for us.
I don't want a situation where like only trans writers can write trans
Exactly.
characters or vice versa, because it's boring, and I've learned a lot from literature. You know, like I mentioned these South American writers earlier, like Copi, someone like Severo Sardoy, you know, like gay men writing kind of quite genderqueer characters, and learned a lot from them. I mean, I write straight characters sometimes.
I hear there are straight people.
Yeah.
Yes, I believe so.
I don't know any, but
So,
I've heard.
you know, I think if things are done in a sort of intelligent spirit, then I think that's the most important thing, if things are done in
They
good
mostly
faith.
come about the murders in my book.
I think it's
Stereotype.
interesting that you're mentioning it as something that's not as black and white as anything is.
Yes.
Because I suppose the flip side of it is assuming that if you are a person of that community, you could not possibly get something wrong. Or
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
like none of us are LGB and T simultaneously.
Yes.
So
Glad you said simultaneous.
I mean, maybe I'm certainly not, but it's assumed that I can
Yeah.
write LGB and T characters,
Exactly.
and I speak for all of us, which of course I
Exactly.
don't. We can only speak for ourselves and our own experiences, really.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is, like, you know, none of us wants to be the poster person for
No, exactly.
one aspect of our lives, because that's not who we are in the round. And it's not, I mean, I don't speak for anybody but myself, you'll all be pleased to hear. And I think that's something we also have to take on board, that we are not speaking for the world, we're speaking of what we know and what we want to say and what we need to say. And I'm afraid on that note, we're going to have to end because we have time constraints. Otherwise, we could have kept going for ages. I'd like to thank the three of you for being here today to launch this marvellous list of 10 writers. There's lots about it on the website. And thank you all very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your festival. Thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to add to Val's thanks there. I'm Peggy, I'm the Programme Director at the National Centre for Writing. We're based in Norwich. And I just want, just thank you all for coming. Thank everyone who joined in from afar on the live stream. I'd like to take a little opportunity just to thank some of the partners that make this kind of project possible. Creative Scotland, Arts Council England, our friends, of course, at British Council. I'd like to thank the National Library of Scotland, and especially Kenny Redpath for having us here today. Of course, to the publishers and the agents who support this kind of work. To the writers themselves, and for this glorious, generous conversation that I certainly could have listened to for a lot longer. I'd like to thank these four, and to Val for her wonderful selection. We are truly living in exceptional times, and it just feels like that calls for exceptional writers and their stories to give us a roadmap. And that's what the International Literature Showcase is all about, to connect those writers with others elsewhere. So just thanks again. Let's just give them another big round of applause. Thank you.